Hello everyone, welcome back to Learn English with Story. Have you ever felt like life was against you? Losing jobs, losing hope, and running out of time? Most people would give up. But one man refused. His name was Colonel Harland Sanders. He was rejected more than 1,000 times. He started his dream when most people retire. And yet, he built KFC, a brand loved worldwide. This is not just about fried chicken. It's about courage, persistence, and the power of never giving up. Stay with me, because the story you're about to hear may change the way you see your own future. Harland David Sanders was born on September 9, 1890, in Henryville, Indiana. He was the eldest son in a poor farming family, and times were already tough. His parents worked hard, but money was always scarce, and life was uncertain. When Harland was just 5 years old, tragedy struck the family suddenly. His father died one afternoon from illness, leaving behind a grieving mother. The death left the family without its main provider, and life became desperate. His mother, Nancy, had no choice but to take any work she could find. She labored long hours outside the home, sewing and doing farm jobs for others. This meant young Harland had to step up in ways children usually never do. At only 5, he began cooking simple meals for his younger brother and sister. He learned how to prepare vegetables, bake bread, and fry chicken in a pan. Sometimes he burned the food, but little by little, he improved each day. Through necessity, he discovered a love for cooking that gave him comfort. While other boys played games after school, Harland stirred pots in the kitchen. He felt pride whenever his siblings smiled at a meal he prepared with care. These early experiences planted the seed for what would later change the world. But school was never easy for him. Money was tight, and his mother often needed him to work instead of study. At 7 years old, he began working part-time on neighboring farms for wages. By 10, he was already a full-time farmhand, earning only $2 each month. Imagine the exhaustion of a small boy plowing fields in the hot summer sun. Despite the hardship, he pushed himself to keep going, day after a long day. Education became a luxury he simply could not afford in those early years. By the time Harland was 12, life at home became even more difficult. His mother remarried, and a stepfather entered the household. But the man was harsh, quick-tempered, and sometimes abusive toward the children. The once warm home now felt hostile, and Harland struggled under his authority. One evening, after an argument, Harland made a bold decision for survival. He packed a small bag, left quietly, and never returned to that house again. At only 12 years old, he stepped into the uncertain world completely alone. It was the beginning of a restless, wandering life filled with endless struggles. He drifted from job to job, doing whatever work he could manage for pay. At 13, he worked on streetcars, helping collect tickets and manage fares. At 15, he took jobs as a farm laborer again, plowing endless fields. Later, he worked as a stoker on a steam locomotive, shoveling heavy coal daily. The heat was unbearable, the hours long, and the pay barely enough for food. For a short period, he even enlisted in the U.S. Army, stationed in Cuba. But his service lasted less than a year, and he returned without prospects. Back home, he tried his hand at many trades, each one ending in disappointment. He worked as a railroad fireman, a streetcar conductor, and even an insurance agent. Each time, misfortune seemed to find him. Businesses closed, or he was dismissed. He moved constantly, carrying only hope and the willingness to try again. By his mid-30s, Harland had already failed at more than a dozen jobs. Yet despite constant rejection, he never gave up searching for stability. Deep down, he clung to one small skill that gave him pride and joy: cooking. Whenever he had the chance, he returned to the stove, preparing meals for others. He knew he could fail at many jobs, but food always gave him confidence. Finally, at 40 years old, opportunity seemed to knock once again. In Corbin, Kentucky, Harland was given a small service station to operate. He sold gasoline to weary travelers driving along the busy highway nearby. But Harland noticed something important during these long days at the station. The travelers weren't just tired. They were hungry, desperate for a good meal. So Harland began cooking for them in the back room of the station. He served fried chicken, country-style gravy, biscuits, and fresh vegetables. The meals were simple but prepared with care and unique seasoning he developed. To his surprise, people loved the food so much they returned again and again. Word spread quickly across Kentucky about the man at the station with great chicken. Soon, people came not just for gasoline, but for the food Harland cooked. By the late 1930s, the service station was more famous for meals than fuel. Encouraged, Harland decided to expand and build a larger restaurant beside the station. It was here that he began experimenting with pressure cookers for frying chicken. This allowed him to cook chicken faster without losing the flavor or tenderness. Through endless trials, he perfected a unique recipe with 11 herbs and spices. The taste was unlike anything people had ever eaten before: crispy, juicy, unforgettable. Locals began lining up and travelers stopped just to taste the famous chicken. Harland's small restaurant gained recognition, even being listed in food reviews. For the first time in decades, he felt a sense of stability and pride. But just when life seemed brighter, fate dealt another crushing blow. The government decided to build a new highway that bypassed his town. Traffic vanished overnight, and customers no longer passed through Corbin. Within months, his thriving restaurant became nearly empty, and debts piled high. Once again, Harland was forced to close his doors and face ruin. At 50, he found himself broke, jobless, and starting from nothing again. Most men at that age would have surrendered, claiming life had defeated them. But Harland Sanders was not most men. His spirit refused to accept failure. He still had his one treasure, the secret recipe he had perfected. He believed with all his heart that this chicken was something extraordinary. So he formed a bold new plan, a plan that most would call crazy. If he couldn't run his own restaurant, he would sell the recipe itself. He would visit restaurants, cook for the owners, and offer a deal. If they liked his chicken, he would take a small share of each sale. It was an unusual model, something almost unheard of at the time. But Harland knew he had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. So in his early 60s, he packed a pressure cooker and wore his white suit. He set out across America, traveling by car, sleeping wherever he could. Door after door, restaurant after restaurant, he offered his chicken to strangers. Most laughed at him or slammed the door before he could even finish. Some told him he was too old, too foolish, chasing an impossible dream. But Harland did not quit. Each rejection, in his mind, meant he was one step closer to success. With every no he heard, his resolve grew stronger, not weaker. Because deep inside, he believed one day someone would finally say, yes. And that belief carried him forward into the next chapter of his journey, a chapter where the world would finally recognize the taste that had defined his life. With his secret recipe in hand, Harland Sanders began a journey unlike any other. He was 62 years old, broke, and living mostly out of his car. But his heart carried one unshakable belief: someone would see the value in his chicken. Each morning he dressed carefully in his white suit and black bow tie. He wanted to look professional, like a man who could be trusted. Then he carried his heavy pressure cooker and bags of seasoning into restaurants. He would politely ask the owner for a chance to cook just one meal. If they liked the taste, he offered them his simple deal. They could use his recipe, and he would take a small commission per sale. But the world is often cruel before it is kind. Restaurant after restaurant turned him away without even trying his food. Some laughed, some mocked him, and others said fried chicken would never sell. At times he cooked for owners who loved the flavor but still refused the deal. They didn't believe customers would care about a recipe from an old man. Rejection after rejection piled up, and the days grew longer and lonelier. He was not turned down 10 times or 50 times. He was rejected more than 100 times, then 200, then 3. By the end, he had faced more than 1,900 no's. Imagine the weight of that disappointment, sleeping in the backseat of his car, eating cheap bread, wondering if hope was gone. Any ordinary person would have given up long before the 1,000th rejection. But Harland Sanders was not ordinary. He believed every no meant he was one step closer to yes. He once said, "I made a resolve that I would not quit." Finally, after nearly 2,000 rejections, one restaurant owner agreed. He tasted the chicken, smiled, and shook Harland's hand. That handshake was the first crack of light in a very dark tunnel. With that first agreement, the door opened for more opportunities. Slowly, one restaurant after another accepted his recipe. People began to notice that this old man had created something special. Word of mouth spread. Diners returned again and again saying, "This chicken is different. This chicken is better." Owners started making real profits from his recipe, and the news traveled quickly. By the time Harland was 65, he had more than a dozen partners. His fried chicken was no longer just food. It was becoming a brand. And that brand carried a name, Kentucky Fried Chicken. But even with growing success, life remained far from easy. He was constantly on the road, sleeping little, cooking constantly, and chasing deals. His body was tired, but his spirit burned stronger with every victory. The image of the white-suited colonel became his trademark. He greeted customers, smiled warmly, and carried himself with dignity. Even children recognized him, pointing excitedly whenever he visited a restaurant. Within a few years, his idea of franchising exploded across the United States. By the age of 70, Kentucky Fried Chicken had spread to hundreds of locations. People lined up outside restaurants, waiting eagerly for the famous crispy chicken. But success always brings new problems. Managing hundreds of franchises was overwhelming for a man in his 70s. He was a cook at heart, not a businessman skilled in finance or law. Sanders often clashed with franchise owners over quality and consistency. He demanded high standards, but many owners tried to cut corners for profit. The bigger the business grew, the more control slipped from his hands. Still, he refused to compromise. He reminded everyone, "This chicken carries my name and it must be right." His fiery personality and high expectations made him both respected and feared. At 73, a group of investors approached him with a proposal. They offered to buy the rights to Kentucky Fried Chicken. The price? $2 million, a fortune at the time. For a man who had lived in poverty most of his life, it was tempting. He was old, exhausted, and uncertain if he could manage the growing empire. After long nights of thought, he finally agreed to sell the company. The deal made him wealthy, but it also left him uneasy. Though he had money, he no longer controlled the company that bore his name. From then on, he was more of a symbol than a true leader. He traveled the world, meeting fans, attending openings, and spreading the story. People loved him, admired his persistence, and saw him as proof of hope. But deep down, he sometimes wondered if he had given away too much. Still, his story was already legendary. From a fatherless boy at 5 to a broke wanderer at 62, he had risen to build a global brand recognized on every street corner. And yet, his journey was not finished, because the years after selling KFC would bring both pride and regret. The final chapter of his life carried lessons just as powerful as the first. After selling Kentucky Fried Chicken, Colonel Sanders thought his work was finished. He had money, he had fame, and he had finally earned respect. But deep inside, he still carried one burden. KFC no longer belonged to him. The new owners wanted to expand quickly. They opened restaurants across America, then across the world. To make more profit, they sometimes cut costs and changed ingredients. When Sanders tasted the food, he was often disappointed. He would frown and say, "This is not my chicken." His fiery temper returned, and he publicly criticized the company he had built. Imagine the pain of watching your life's work lose its original quality. For Sanders, it felt like losing a child. He had struggled for decades to create something perfect, only to see it changed. Yet he never stopped wearing his white suit. He never stopped calling himself the Colonel. And wherever he went, people loved him for his story and his persistence. He became a living symbol of resilience. Airports, streets, and restaurants welcomed him with cheers and applause. Children would run to shake his hand, and families lined up for photographs. Even though he had sold KFC, he remained its heart and soul. The company used his image in advertisements, his voice in commercials. His face became one of the most recognized brands in the world. But his personal journey was not all pride and glory. Sanders often regretted selling the company for only $2 million. Decades later, KFC would be worth billions, far more than he ever received. Still, he found peace in his role as an ambassador. He traveled to hundreds of KFC locations around the globe. From Canada to Japan, people welcomed the Colonel as if he were family. He shook hands, smiled for cameras, and told stories of never giving up. He reminded audiences that age is just a number and dreams have no deadline. His presence alone inspired millions who thought their time had passed. Even in his late 80s, Sanders remained full of energy. He gave interviews, attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and shared his humor. When asked about his late success, he often laughed and said, "I'm only sorry I didn't start sooner." But behind the laughter, he had lived through more failure than most could bear. He had buried dreams, lost businesses, faced poverty, and endured humiliation. And yet, he turned every failure into a stepping stone. In 1980, at the age of 90, Colonel Sanders passed away. The world mourned the loss of the man in the white suit. His funeral drew crowds, and tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. But his legacy was already alive in every KFC restaurant. By then, the chain had spread to more than 60 countries. Today, it has over 27,000 locations in more than 150 nations. From a poor boy cooking for his siblings at 5, to a tired man rejected 1 in 9 times, to the founder of a global empire, this was the journey of Harland Sanders. What lessons can we take from his extraordinary story? First, that failure is not the end. It is part of the road to success. Second, that age does not limit dreams. 62 was only his beginning. And third, that persistence outlasts almost everything. He was rejected almost 2,000 times, but once was enough to change history. The Colonel proved that one yes can erase 1,000 no's. So what about you? What dream have you buried because you thought you were too old, too late, too tired? What idea have you abandoned because of rejection or fear? Remember Sanders in his car, poor and hungry, knocking on doors at 62? Remember his determination when the world told him he had no chance? And remember his smile when finally someone believed if he could rise from poverty to global fame in his 60s, then you too can rise from your challenges today? The only real question is, will you keep knocking until the door opens? Because success does not belong to the lucky. It belongs to the persistent. It belongs to those who refuse to quit, no matter the obstacles. And so, as we close this story, let us honor the Colonel's life, not only for the crispy chicken that made him famous, but for the courage and grit that made him unforgettable. May his journey remind you that failure is never final. May his persistence inspire you to take that next step, and may his story light a fire inside you to keep chasing your dream. This is the legacy of Colonel Sanders, proof that it's never too late. So, my friends, as you go back to your own path, carry this truth. Your best chapter may still be unwritten. Thank you for listening to this story on Learn English with Story. If it inspired you, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends. Remember, your time is not over. Your dream is not gone.